I grew up believing that rusted International Harvester would be mine someday. Every summer morning, I'd watch Grandpa Joe climb into that faded red seat, his weathered hands gripping the steering wheel like it was made of gold. The engine would cough to life with a familiar rumble that seemed to shake the very foundations of our family farm in rural Nebraska. "This here's gonna be yours one day, Tommy," he'd tell me, patting the hood with the same affection most people reserved for beloved pets. I was 12 then, all gangly limbs and big dreams about continuing the family legacy. The tractor wasn't just a machine, it was a symbol of 4 generations of Hartwell farmers who'd worked this same soil through dust bowls and droughts, market crashes, and miraculous harvests. Every weekend, I'd help Grandpa maintain that old girl. We'd change the oil together, replace worn belts, and I'd listen to him tell stories about how his father had bought it new in 1952. "Cost more than a house back then," he'd chuckle, "but it paid for itself 10 times over." The tractor had pulled countless loads of corn and soybeans, carved furrows in frozen ground, and somehow kept running through decades of hard labor. I learned to drive on that machine when I was 14, my feet barely reaching the pedals. Grandpa sat beside me, steady and patient, teaching me the rhythm of farming, when to shift gears, how to read the soil, the art of making straight rows. Those moments felt sacred, like I was being inducted into something larger than myself. By the time I turned 18, I could operate that tractor like an extension of my own body. I knew every quirk, every sound it made, every lever and gauge. It was my inheritance, my birthright, my future. Grandpa Joe passed on a cold Tuesday in March, just as the fields were awakening from winter's grip. The funeral was everything you'd expect for a man who'd spent 73 years on the same plot of land. The church overflowing with neighbors, fellow farmers, and townspeople whose lives he'd touched. The pastor spoke about stewardship and legacy, about a man who'd lived by the seasons and died with dirt still under his fingernails. I sat in the front pew between Mom and Dad, staring at the simple pine coffin and thinking about that tractor sitting silent in the barn. For the first time in decades, it hadn't started that morning. It was like the machine knew its master was gone, like some essential spark had died with the old man who'd loved it so dearly. After the service, people gathered at the farmhouse, sharing casseroles and memories. Uncle Frank, Dad's younger brother who'd moved to the city years ago, seemed different somehow, more animated than usual, checking his phone constantly, making hushed phone calls on the front porch. I caught fragments of conversations about property values and development potential, words that felt foreign and ugly in a house still warm with the scent of Grandma's apple pie recipe. Dad looked lost without his father's steady presence. The two of them had worked the farm together for 30 years, a seamless partnership built on shared understanding and mutual respect. Now, Dad faced the daunting prospect of managing everything alone, at least until I finished college and could take my rightful place behind the wheel of that international harvester. "Don't worry, son," Dad whispered to me as we stood by Grandpa's empty chair at the kitchen table. "That tractor's yours, always has been, always will be." 3 weeks after the funeral, just as we were planning spring planting, our family attorney called with news that would shatter everything I thought I knew about my future. Maxwell Henderson had been handling our family's legal affairs for over 20 years, his calm, measured voice a constant in times of uncertainty. But that Tuesday afternoon, even his professional composure couldn't mask the awkwardness of what he had to tell us. "I need you all to come to my office," he said to Dad over the kitchen phone speaker. "There's been a development regarding Joe's will, a significant development." The way he emphasized those words sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the unseasonably cold spring weather outside our windows. Mum and Dad exchanged glances across the kitchen table where we'd been reviewing seed catalogues and planning the season's crops. Something in their expressions told me this wasn't just about paperwork or tax implications. This was bigger, more complicated than the straightforward inheritance we'd all assumed would pass from father to son as it had for generations. "What kind of development?" Dad asked, his voice tight with a tension I'd rarely heard before. "We've been planning based on what Joe told us. Tommy's supposed to take over operations after college, and that tractor—" "Please, Mr. Henderson interrupted gently. "This is something we need to discuss in person. Can you be here tomorrow at 2? The formal tone, so different from his usual warm familiarity with our family, filled the kitchen with an ominous silence. That night, none of us slept well. I lay in my childhood bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the wind rattle the windows, thinking about all the assumptions I'd built my future around. The tractor, the farm, the legacy. It had all seemed so certain, so unshakable. Now, for the first time, doubt crept in like frost on spring seedlings. Henderson's law office occupied the second floor of a century-old brick building in the center of town, its tall windows overlooking Main Street's collection of family businesses and empty storefronts. The waiting room smelled of old leather and coffee, filled with the kind of heavy wooden furniture that suggested permanence and tradition. But as we sat there, Dad, Mom, Uncle Frank and me, tradition felt like a fragile thing, easily broken by whatever revelation awaited us. When Henderson called us into his office, his usually warm demeanor had been replaced by professional caution. He gestured for us to sit around his conference table, then opened a thick manila folder with hands that seemed to tremble slightly. "Joe came to see me 6 months ago," he began, his words measured and careful. "He wanted to make some changes to his will, but he insisted on absolute secrecy until after his death." Uncle Frank leaned forward in his chair, his expensive suit a sharp contrast to our farm clothes. "What kind of changes?" he asked, his voice carrying an edge of anticipation that made my stomach churn. For weeks, he'd been making comments about modernizing the operation, bringing in professional management, words that felt like a betrayal of everything Grandpa had built. Henderson pulled out a document I'd never seen before, its pages crisp and official-looking. "This is the true last will and testament of Joseph Hartwell," he announced. "The version you're familiar with was actually drafted 15 years ago. This one supersedes it entirely." He looked directly at me as he spoke the next words. "Tommy, I'm afraid the inheritance you expected has been redistributed." The room went silent, except for the tick of an antique clock on Henderson's desk. Mom reached over and grabbed Dad's hand, her knuckles white with tension. Uncle Frank sat back with what looked suspiciously like satisfaction, while I felt the floor beneath my chair seemed to shift and buckle like quicksand. Henderson spread the will across the conference table like a dealer revealing a winning hand, but this game had no winners, only the wreckage of assumptions and the bitter taste of betrayal. His finger traced down the document's dense legal language until he found the section that would change everything. The farm itself, all 640 acres, has been left in trust to Thomas Hartwell, he read, but with specific restrictions and conditions. My heart leaped for a moment. The land was still mine, but Henderson's expression warned me that hope was premature. "However," he continued, "all equipment, including the 1952 International Harvester tractor, all buildings, livestock, and liquid assets have been bequeathed to Frank Hartwell with the explicit instruction that he modernize and commercialize the operation within 5 years. The words hit me like a physical blow. Uncle Frank couldn't suppress a smile as Henderson explained the twisted logic behind Grandpa's decision. According to the will, Grandpa had grown concerned about my romantic notions about farming, my attachment to outdated methods and sentimental equipment. He wanted to ensure the farm's financial viability, even if it meant breaking the chain of tradition that had defined our family for generations. "This can't be right," Dad said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Joe and I talked about this for years. Tommy was supposed to inherit everything, just like I did, just like Joe did from his father." But Henderson's sympathetic expression confirmed our worst fears. The will was legally sound, witnessed and notarized, beyond challenge or appeal. Uncle Frank finally spoke, his voice carefully modulated to sound reasonable, despite the devastating impact of his words. "Joe was worried about the farm's future," he explained. "Small operations like this are dying out. Tommy's a smart kid, but he needs to understand that farming today is about efficiency and scale, not nostalgia and old tractors." The drive home from Henderson's office passed in stunned silence, each of us lost in the implications of Grandpa's betrayal. But if I thought the worst was over, I was wrong. Uncle Frank followed us back to the farmhouse, his luxury sedan looking absurdly out of place next to our pickup trucks and farm equipment. He'd asked for a chance to explain his vision for the property, and despite our shock and anger, curiosity won out. Frank spread architectural drawings and business plans across our kitchen table, documents that had clearly been prepared well in advance. His proposal was ambitious and horrifying in equal measure: tear down the old barn and farmhouse, sell the International Harvester to a museum, and convert the entire operation into an industrial-scale corn and soybean factory. "We're talking about tripling production," he said, his eyes bright with entrepreneurial enthusiasm. "GPS-guided tractors, automated irrigation, the latest in precision agriculture. The new operation would require massive initial investment, loans secured against the property value, partnerships with agricultural corporations, and the complete elimination of everything that made our farm feel like home." Frank had already been in contact with equipment dealers and construction companies, ready to begin demolition as soon as the estate cleared probate. "Tommy can stay involved, of course," he added, as if offering me a job on my own land was some kind of generous concession. Dad listened to the presentation with growing horror, occasionally glancing at me as if seeking some kind of guidance or support. But I was beyond speech, watching our family's heritage being dissected with PowerPoint presentations and financial projections. The old tractor would be gone within months, replaced by anonymous machines operated by hired crews who'd never known the satisfaction of working soil their grandfathers had tilled. "You're talking about destroying everything Joe built," Mom finally said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. But Frank just shook his head, genuinely puzzled by our attachment to what he saw as inefficient sentimentality. That night, I couldn't bear to stay in the house listening to my parents debate options we didn't really have. Instead, I walked out to the barn where the International Harvester sat silent and still, moonlight streaming through gaps in the weathered boards to illuminate its faded red paint. I climbed into the driver's seat one more time, my hands gripping the worn steering wheel as I tried to make sense of Grandpa's decision. That's when I heard footsteps on the gravel outside. Dad appeared in the doorway, his face gaunt with exhaustion and grief. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked, settling onto a hay bale beside the tractor. For a long moment, we sat in comfortable silence, surrounded by the tools and memories of 4 generations of farming. Then Dad began to speak, his voice low and thoughtful. "There's something I never told you about this place," he said, running his fingers along the tractor's ancient fender. "Something your grandfather made me promise to keep secret until now, I guess." He stood up and walked to a corner of the barn I'd never paid much attention to, where old feed sacks and rusty equipment created a kind of improvised storage area. Behind a stack of fertilizer bags, Dad revealed a wooden crate I'd never noticed before. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and protected from moisture, were documents that would change everything once again. Your great-grandfather left instructions, Dad explained, lifting out papers that looked even older than the will that had devastated us that morning. Instructions that your grandfather was supposed to follow if the farm was ever threatened. The documents included property surveys, mineral rights assessments, and correspondence with geologists dating back to the 1940s. But most important was a letter in my great-grandfather's careful handwriting, addressed to whoever comes after me when the time of testing arrives. As Dad read the letter aloud by flashlight, I began to understand that our family's story was far more complex than I'd ever imagined. Great-grandfather's letter revealed a secret that had been passed down through 3 generations of Hartwell men. Our farm sat on top of one of the largest underground aquifers in the state, a vast reservoir of pure water that would become increasingly valuable as climate change and industrial agriculture depleted water sources across the Midwest. The land isn't valuable for farming alone, the letter explained. It's valuable for what lies beneath. According to the documents, my great-grandfather had quietly purchased water rights to not just our property, but several adjacent farms, accumulating claims that would be worth millions in today's market. He'd foreseen a time when water would become more precious than oil, when our modest farming operation would be sitting on a fortune that could sustain the family for generations, if we were patient enough to wait for the right moment. Joe knew about this, Dad explained, his voice heavy with implications I was only beginning to understand. He's been getting offers from water companies for years, but he always said the timing wasn't right. Too much attention, too many legal complications. He wanted to wait until... Dad's voice trailed off as the pieces began falling into place. The modernization Uncle Frank was planning would require massive irrigation systems and deep wells that would inevitably lead to the discovery of the aquifer. Corporate partners would investigate the water resources, environmental assessments would reveal the true scope of what lay beneath our soil, and suddenly our quiet family farm would become the center of a bidding war between agricultural giants and water companies. Frank doesn't know, Dad continued, but Joe was counting on that. He figured Frank's development plans would expose the water rights within a year or two, and then he gestured toward another document in the crate, this one bearing the seal of the Nebraska Department of Natural Resources. This gives us first option to buy back all equipment and buildings at assessed value once the water rights are activated. I stared at my father in the dim barn light, finally understanding the complexity of Grandpa's strategy. It wasn't betrayal. It was the most elaborate inheritance plan imaginable. The next few months were the hardest of my life, watching Uncle Frank begin his transformation of our family farm while pretending not to know what was coming. Construction crews arrived to demolish the old barn, their heavy machinery tearing down structures that had sheltered our equipment for decades. The International Harvester was loaded onto a flatbed truck destined for an agricultural museum in Iowa, its departure marking the end of an era I'd thought would last forever. Frank moved quickly with his modernization plans, bringing in corporate partners and agricultural consultants who saw our land as nothing more than a resource to be optimized. GPS-guided tractors arrived to replace the old equipment, their computer-controlled precision a sharp contrast to the intuitive farming methods I'd learned from Grandpa. Everything was efficient, profitable, and utterly without soul. But Dad and I knew we just had to wait. The new irrigation systems Frank was installing would require environmental impact studies and water usage permits that would inevitably reveal the aquifer beneath our feet. Every day brought us closer to the moment when our patient endurance would be rewarded with the revelation of Grandpa's true gift to our family. I threw myself into my college studies with renewed focus, earning degrees in both agricultural science and water resource management, credentials I'd need when the time came to reclaim our inheritance. Dad worked for Frank as a hired hand on land he'd once owned, swallowing his pride and biding his time while corporate managers made decisions about soil his father had nurtured for decades. The hardest part was watching Frank's satisfaction as his plans came together. He genuinely believed he was saving the farm from obsolescence, dragging our family kicking and screaming into the modern agricultural economy. His new tractors produced impressive yields, his corporate partnerships generated steady revenue, and his efficiency metrics looked excellent on paper. He had no idea he was laying the groundwork for his own downfall. 18 months after Uncle Frank's modernization began, his luck ran out in the most predictable way possible. The deep irrigation wells his corporate partners had drilled struck the aquifer at 200 feet, bringing up water so pure and abundant that it immediately attracted attention from state environmental officials. Within weeks, geological surveys confirmed what our family had known for decades. We were sitting on one of the most valuable water resources in the entire Midwest. The phone calls started almost immediately. Representatives from agricultural corporations, municipal water departments, and environmental groups all wanted to discuss partnership opportunities and resource development possibilities. Frank, who'd invested everything in equipment and infrastructure loans, suddenly found himself in over his head as lawyers and hydrologists descended on our property like locusts. "I don't understand," he told Dad over coffee in the farmhouse kitchen that had somehow survived his renovation plans. "The water rights weren't part of Joe's will. How can there be claims going back to the 1940s? Dad just shrugged, playing the role of confused hired hand, while Frank frantically tried to understand the legal maze his development plans had uncovered. That's when Henderson made his second bombshell announcement. The law office that had delivered such devastating news 2 years earlier now became the site of our family's vindication. "It appears," Henderson explained to a room full of water company representatives and environmental lawyers, "that the Hartwell family has maintained continuous ownership of all subsurface water rights to this property since 1943. Frank's face went white as Henderson produced the documents we'd found in the barn, authenticated and registered with the state decades before his corporate partners had even heard of our little farm. His modernization project, far from securing his control over the property, had instead triggered the very mechanism Grandpa had put in place to ensure our family's ultimate victory. The legal machinery that Uncle Frank had unknowingly set in motion moved with swift efficiency. State regulations required that any significant aquifer discovery trigger a review of existing water rights and land use practices. Frank's corporate partners, facing potential liability for unauthorized water extraction, quickly distanced themselves from the project, leaving him personally responsible for equipment loans and construction costs he couldn't possibly repay. Meanwhile, water companies began making offers that dwarfed anything Frank's agricultural operation could generate. Municipal utilities from drought-stricken cities offered long-term contracts worth tens of millions of dollars. Environmental groups proposed conservation partnerships that would preserve the aquifer while providing sustainable income for generations. Suddenly, our modest farm had become the center of a bidding war that made Frank's modernization profits look like pocket change. "I want to make a deal," Frank said when he finally cornered Dad and me in Henderson's office 3 months after the water discovery. His earlier confidence had been replaced by desperation as the financial realities of his situation became clear. The equipment loans, construction costs, and legal fees had pushed him to the edge of bankruptcy, while the activated water rights gave our family options he couldn't match. Henderson spread the relevant documents across his conference table, but this time, the advantage was entirely ours. The mechanism great-grandfather had built into the property deed was elegantly simple. Once water rights were activated through commercial development, the original Hartwell Family Trust could reclaim all equipment and buildings at assessed value. Frank's improvements and modernization had actually increased the value we could claim back, while his debts remained his personal responsibility. The 1952 International Harvester, I said, consulting the inventory list Henderson had prepared, is currently valued at $45,000 as a restored antique. The museum in Iowa has maintained it in perfect condition. Frank winced as he realized that even his attempt to dispose of our family's most treasured possession had backfired spectacularly. 6 months later, I stood in the same barn where Dad had revealed great-grandfather's secret. But everything was different now. The International Harvester was back home, restored to better condition than it had been in decades, its red paint gleaming and its engine purring with mechanical perfection. The museum in Iowa had been happy to sell it back to us once they understood the family's significance, and the water rights income meant we could afford to keep it running for pure sentiment rather than practical necessity. Uncle Frank had taken a job with an agricultural consulting firm in Omaha, his dreams of modernizing our farm replaced by the harsh realities of bankruptcy and professional humiliation. Dad felt sorry for him, but I couldn't summon much sympathy for a man who'd been so eager to destroy our family's heritage for short-term profit. His corporate partners had vanished as soon as the legal complications emerged, leaving him to face the consequences alone. The water rights contracts we'd negotiated would provide sustainable income while preserving the aquifer for future generations. We'd kept enough agricultural land to maintain a working farm, but now we farmed by choice rather than economic necessity. The pressure to maximize every acre's productivity was gone, replaced by the freedom to farm the way Grandpa had taught me, with respect for the land and attention to the rhythms of nature. Your great-grandfather was a smart man, Dad said, as we worked together to prepare the tractor for spring planting. He understood that the real inheritance wasn't just the land or the equipment. It was the knowledge and patience to wait for the right moment. The old machine responded to my touch like a faithful dog, its familiar sounds and movements a bridge between past and future. That evening, I climbed into the tractor's seat once more, this time not as a nostalgic farewell, but as a rightful inheritance finally claimed. The setting sun painted the fields in shades of gold and amber, and for the first time in years, the future looked as bright as the past. Today, 5 years after Grandpa's death, I understand that his greatest gift wasn't the tractor or the land, or even the water rights. It was the lesson in patience and strategic thinking that turned apparent betrayal into ultimate triumph. The old International Harvester still runs every day during planting and harvest seasons, but now it's joined by modern equipment we can afford without debt or corporate partnerships. I married Sarah last spring, a girl from town who understands the value of tradition balanced with practical progress. She laughs when I tell her the story of how I almost lost everything, then gained more than I'd ever dreamed possible. Your grandfather was quite the chess player, she says, and she's right. Every move he made, even the ones that seemed like betrayals, were part of a strategy so complex I'm still discovering its implications. Uncle Frank visits occasionally, his earlier resentment replaced by grudging respect for the old man who'd outmaneuvered him so completely. He works for a water management company now, using the expertise he'd gained during his brief ownership of our farm to help other families navigate the complex intersection of agriculture and resource development. It's honest work, and it pays well enough for him to rebuild his life after the bankruptcy. The farm thrives under our management, producing sustainable yields while preserving the aquifer that ensures our family's security for generations to come. I've started teaching my nephew, my sister's boy, how to drive the International Harvester passing down the same lessons Grandpa taught me about reading the soil, respecting the seasons, and understanding that some inheritances are worth waiting for. Every morning when I start that old engine, I can hear Grandpa's voice in the familiar rumble. "This here's gonna be yours one day, Tommy." He was right, but he never told me I'd have to lose it first to truly understand its value. Sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as the deepest losses, and the best revenge is living well long enough to prove the doubters wrong. The red tractor runs on, carrying the weight of 4 generations and the promise of many more to come.